Hi guys, I'm Sarah Riggs, and in my group is Rick and Renee, and we're doing Unit 4, so we're going to be talking all about the Civil War. I'm going to start with what led to the Civil War, and one major factor that led to the Civil War is early abolitionism, and that kind of sparked during the time of the Revolution, especially among Quakers, and it's seen again in the Second Great Awakening, when many hearts were fueled morally to think that slavery was wrong. And so in the 1830s, abolitionism was just sparked. It skyrocketed because British counterparts released their slaves in the West Indies, and so America thought, hey, what about our slaves? So this kind of led to believing that sending African Americans back to Africa would be beneficial. And so America started shipping African Americans back to Africa, even if they were American born and bred. And so most of the time it was against their will. Another important abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison, who kind of grew into supporting abolitionism. And to show his support, he created The Liberator, which is his anti-slavery newspaper. And it kind of spread realization throughout the nation and awakened more abolitionism movements. And this also influenced Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it told the truth and the horrors of slavery, and it spread it to the North, who started to question the peculiar institution, quote unquote. So another major factor that led to the Civil War were slave revolts, and there were many, but one of the more significant ones is Nat Turner's Rebellion, and it was organized by Nat Turner, and it took place in Southampton, in Virginia, and he rallied up all these slaves, and they went and killed 55 to 60 people, which is actually at the time the highest number of fatalities caused by any slave uprising. And so this kind of caused a mass hysteria, and which led to white militias being organized and retaliating against these slaves, which therefore ended up in the death and execution of hundreds of innocent African Americans. And along with this, it led to tighter slave codes and slave laws to ensure that an uprising like this would not happen again. And this overall caused a mass hysteria and ended in more tension between the North and the South about slavery. So overall, there are a bunch of major causes that led to the Civil War, and here's kind of a list. Each of these bullet points kind of goes back to the point that each event caused more tension between the North and the South. So, for example, the Tariff of 1828, it was nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, and it outraged Southerners who felt that the tax on imports was excessive, and it targeted their region. So it kind of angered the South more, and it heightened tensions. So in general, the Tariff of Abominations was a really, really high tax on goods imported into the United States, and it actually did create major economic problems for the South. So it added to the tension between the North and the South, which led to the Nullification Crisis, which was a sectional crisis during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, created by South Carolina's Ordinance of Nullification. It declared the power of the state that the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were unconstitutional and therefore null and void. So basically they challenged the Tariff of Abominations, and it turned out it was null and void because it was unconstitutional. Another major cause of the Civil War, it kind of doesn't go along with the tariffs, but it is a very significant factor, is the Underground Railroad. And it was a network of secret routes and safe houses used by slaves of African descent to escape to free states with the aid of abolitionists. So this kind of, when discovered, it was very, it heightened tensions again because slavery was a big issue between the North and the South. So next is the Mexican-American War, which is also another significant factor that led to the Civil War because it was an armed conflict between the United States and the Republic of Mexico over the U.S. annexation of Texas, which Mexico considered to be part of its territory. This kind of led to the Compromise of 1850 because the Compromise of 1850 determined it split up the land and the territory acquired from the Mexican-American War to see what was free and what was slave. And after this was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is really significant because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it required that all escaped slaves were, upon capture, to be returned to their masters, and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate in this law. So abolitionists actually named this the Bloodhound Law because it was very strict, and it tightened the hold on slaves, and it showed an increase in Southern power, and so it kind of was also an increase in Northern fear of that power. Another significant factor is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, but it also stated that the land can vote whether or not the territory will be free or slave. Following this, a very significant factor that led to the Civil War is the Bleeding Kansas, and it was a series of violent political confrontations in the United States involving anti-slavery free staters and pro-slavery border ruffian elements that took place in the Kansas Territory and the neighboring towns of the state of Missouri between 1854 and 1861. So it was about the decision about slavery and whether it should be made by the settlers or the outsiders, so people that came into the state and voted. So it was all about voting and voting on whether the state should be slave or free. Another important factor is the Dred Scott versus Sanford. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case, and it stated that African Americans, whether slave or free, could not be American citizens, and this kind of heightened tensions between the North and the South because it put another roadblock in the abolitionist movement. It was another way to separate and segregate slavery and African Americans from becoming. It's another roadblock in making slaves more equal with American citizens. Okay, so next is the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and this was a series of 7 debates between Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen Douglas, who was the Democratic Party candidate, and Lincoln was the Republican candidate. And so they were both trying for their respective parties to win control of the Illinois legislature. So it previewed issues that Lincoln would face in the aftermath of his victory in the 1860 presidential election. So the main issue discussed was slavery. This kind of led to the Civil War because they pushed the series of debates pushed Douglas to take positions that further undercut his support in the South and alienated the Douglas factions. And so it increased the likelihood of a split in the Democratic Party in 1860. And lastly, a big cause of the Civil War was the election of Lincoln. The presidential election of 1860, Lincoln won. And before Lincoln's inauguration, 7 southern states declared their succession and later formed the Confederacy. So once Lincoln was elected president, a few states officially left and formed the South. And so tensions were heightened, and the divide was officially made.
The Civil War began on April 12th of 1861 at the Battle of Fort Sumter, located in Charleston, South Carolina. At around 4:30 a.m., the Confederates opened fire with 50 cannons upon the fort, beginning the Civil War. About 3 months later, in July, The First Battle of Bull Run took place. The Confederate Army won this battle, but to the Union Army it was more of a big realization. Lincoln realized that it would be a long war and not nothing short of what he thought it would be. It would also consist of a lot of casualties on both sides. On March 8th and March 9th of 1862, both Merrimac and Monitor ironclad ships fought it out in naval warfare. Although it was a big advancement in the military industry, it didn't really cause much of a difference during the war because both of the ships were equally matched and came to a standstill eventually when the war ended. On June 25th and July 1st, the 7-day battle began. It was not much of a big battle. Well, it was actually a very big battle because there was a lot of casualties on both sides. But nothing major really happened besides that they realized that this is going to be a very bloody war. Now on to the bloodiest war of the Civil War is on September 17th of 1862, which was when the Battle of Antietam began. It is known as the bloodiest war because there was around 26,000 men killed or missing, and it eventually actually led to a Union victory. Then on January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln. It basically said that all slaves that were captured in the Southern War would become free slaves. This basically changed the tide of the war, as most people thought that the Civil War was just to secure the Union and bring it all back together. This further leads to July 1st through July 3rd of 1863, better known as the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a Union victory and also a turning point of the war because it boosted the morale of the Union and made them realize that they could actually defeat the Confederates, even though they had their great leaders such as Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Although the Confederates did have good commanding generals, the Union also did have Ulysses S. Grant. He was known to fight a war of attrition, which basically meant that he would prolong the war for a period of time and basically gradually wear out the other side until they basically ran out of soldiers that could fight. Lincoln saw this as, although it could be bad, he saw this as a good thing because he realized that it's basically what they needed. The North had enough supplies to continue the war and the South was very limited, so the only way they could actually defeat the Confederates was to wear them out and use as much supplies as they can. This was shown in the Siege of Vicksburg because it was basically a Union victory by Grant, and like I said, it was a war of attrition. He basically bombed the city for about 6 weeks and basically starved out all the citizens and Confederate soldiers who were down there until they gave up. As the war dragged on, however, on July 13th through July 16th, there was something of 1863, there was something in New York known as the New York Draft Riots. People were furious because they had to join the war and they had no way of escaping it unless they had money. So basically, all the people who had money got to escape and the rich lived on, and all those who did not have money had to join the war and risk their lives for the nation. This actually infuriated a lot of people and caused several problems. Later, on January 31st of 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed, and it basically says that the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude. So basically, all slaves, having a slave would be illegal, basically. So slavery became illegal, and all slaves became free. And then later, on April 18th of 1865, General Lee surrenders, and Grant wins the war for the Union in the North.
Okay, so at the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction began to help heal our separated country. Lincoln, first of all, introduced the 10% Plan to hasten Reconstruction. The 10% Plan meant that 10% of Southern voters would be required to take an oath of loyalty before the state would be readmitted into the Union. It was meant to be quick and painless, but not really liked by radical Republicans who thought the South should be punished severely. They, in turn, created the Wade-Davis Bill, which said that 50% of white males had to take an ironclad oath of allegiance before the state could call a constitutional convention. States also had to abolish slavery. Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill and killed it before it could actually get anywhere. So, Lincoln was shot and killed at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. When this happened, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern congressman who stayed in the North during secession. This meant that he was not trusted by Northerners because they thought his allegiances still lied with the South, and hated by Southerners because he didn't come with them during secession. He also followed Lincoln's 10% plan with two added conditions. Leading Confederates were to be disenfranchised, and the states must protect the rights of the freedmen. He, however, did have many conflicts with Congress, in which he even vetoed the Civil Rights Bill. Congress, however, passed the bill by making it into the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and ratified it in 1868. However, Andrew Johnson lost the election of 1868 after a failed speech tour. So other forms of Reconstruction were military Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts where soldiers were stationed to keep things under control. To be readmitted, the states had to pass the 13th and 14th Amendments and guarantee black suffrage. However, radical Republicans were still worried that black suffrage would be removed, so they wrote the 15th Amendment and ratified it in 1870. So for African Americans after the Civil War, they kind of had a mix of both good and bad. The Freedmen's Bureau was an early form of welfare, providing food, clothing, and health care and education. However, its success was very minimal. There were also union leagues in which blacks were informed of their civic duties. They built churches and pushed for Republican candidates in the elections. They sought to solve problems and even recruited a black militia for defense. With many white Southerners unable to vote because of being involved with the Confederacy, many black congressmen were elected as well. So many African Americans didn't really know anything else besides farming, so they went into sharecropping, in which landowners would allow a tenant to use land in return for a share of the crop produced on the land. However, most of these people were in continuous debt to their landowner. There were also black codes put in place that basically kept African Americans in a subservient position, along with Jim Crow laws, which legalized the segregation of races in public places, the constitutionality of which was upheld by Plessy versus Ferguson, which stated racial segregation was constitutional under the doctrine separate but equal. So things got worse when the Ku Klux Klan formed, so that they could keep blacks in their place and ensure that they would never surpass white. They thrived on fear and burnt crosses and threatened blacks who didn't know their place. They also lynched and often tar and feathered African Americans as well. There were also many methods used to disenfranchise blacks, including poll taxes that many African Americans couldn't pay at the poll. Also literacy tests that were made more difficult for African Americans on purpose. There was also the grandfather clause, which said that anyone whose grandfather was able to vote could also vote. However, most slaves' grandfathers were also slaves and could not vote, so therefore these African Americans would not be able to vote. So in the election of 1868, Grant won against Horatio Seymour by reminding voters of his military record and basically waving the bloody shirt. He would end up as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. However, during his presidency, Grant did lobby for the 15th Amendment to be passed and signed the Amnesty Act, which returned political rights to former Confederates. So to end Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877, which basically was an unwritten agreement that Rutherford B. Hayes would win the election of 1876, so long as the Republicans pulled out all troops from the South and ended military Reconstruction. So at the end of this compromise, this compromise effectively ended the Reconstruction era, and America was now unified again. So yeah.